Hello again, everyone. I'm Father Joe Nazel, coming to you this week from Precious Blood Renewal Center in Liberty, Missouri. The New York Times on Easter Sunday published an op-ed piece by Peter Werner that had the title, "Why is Jesus Still Wounded After the Resurrection?" And the writer explores the question of why did Jesus still bear the marks of crucifixion even after he rose from the dead? After all, he said, scars are signs of imperfection, something most of us try to hide. And in the case of Jesus, they were reminders of the searing pain, the vulnerability, and the indignity of the crucifixion. One possible answer is found in the story that Carol Howard Merritt tells about a friend of hers who was asked by her doctor what kind of plastic surgery she wanted to remove the wound, the scar, a major scar from surgery. And the woman said, "Are you serious? Do you really think I'm going to give up my bragging rights? I earned the scar." And Merritt imagines Jesus stepping into that upper room and showing his friends his hands, his side, and his feet, and saying, "Hey, check out my scars." He certainly earned them. We all have wounds and scars from the sheer experience of living in this world where hate and violence do not take a break for Easter. With the mass shooting in Rock Hill, South Carolina last week, where a former professional football player killed 5 people, including 2 children, before he turned the gun on himself, there have been 140 mass shootings in this country from the beginning of January through last week. 166 people have died, and more than 500 people have been wounded in this pandemic of violence. We certainly have a pandemic for this last year of the coronavirus, but for many years now we've had a pandemic of violence, especially gun violence in this country. And Luis Rodriguez, in a book called Hearts and Hands, Creating Community in Violent Times, named this violence and said there is a wound in the land. Certainly there's a wound in the land. The wound of racism is still very much with us. And this wound in the body politic, Rodriguez says, this wound in our collective spirit beckons us to believe that healing involves going directly to the wound, not recoiling from it. The wound, the damage, he said, can be the mother of our rebirth, the mother of our reconciliation. This is the lesson, I think, that Jesus is trying to teach his disciples in the gospel we hear on Divine Mercy Sunday, the gospel we just had last Sunday, when he appears to his fearful friends locked behind closed doors in that upper room. He shows them his hands and his side, and he says, "Peace be with you." The wounds of the crucifixion are visible on the body of Christ. His hands and feet bear the marks where the nails were punctured and pounded into his flesh. His side bore the scar from when the soldier pushed the spear to see if Jesus was dead. In a world that has been so wounded by violence and hate, the image of a risen and scarred Lord shouts to us that true reconciliation and peace are only possible when we name the violence, when we name the wound. In the resurrection appearances of Jesus to his disciples, remember, they're still trying to put all the pieces back together. They're trying to put their broken hearts back together. And Jesus doesn't present himself as good as new. Though his grace is the most powerful substance known to humankind, he does not use his grace as a glue to mend their broken dreams, their broken hearts, and their fragments of faith back together again. Instead, his resurrected body carries the wounds of crucifixion, and he's not afraid to show his scars. Jesus seems to be telling his frightened followers, who are still trying to make sense out of his death, that the resurrection is not so much about putting the pieces of our shattered lives back together, putting the pieces of our broken relationships back together, putting the pieces of our wounded world back together and making them as good as new, but rather, Jesus seems to be saying, Easter is about picking up those broken pieces and holding them in the light of the risen Christ, to see how we might become, out of all these broken pieces, a new creation. Each of us is wounded in some way. We all have scars. The question is, what do we do with those wounds? What do we do with those scars? How do we live through them? And that will determine whether or not our lives reveal or conceal the saving power of Christ, the risen Christ, compassion and love. When we live from the cracked and broken places of our lives, we learn a little bit more about humility, about patience, about vulnerability. When we're vulnerable enough to touch our wounds, trace our scars, we deepen the well of our empathy so that we might give another thirsty soul a drink from the cup of compassion and care. We learn compassion. I firmly believe this. We learn compassion from our own experiences of suffering and woundedness, of brokenness and betrayal. When someone asks us, how did we get that scar? How did you get that scar? That's an invitation to dialogue. It's an invitation to tell a story, because behind every scar, there's a story. And whether those scars are inscribed on our skin or on our souls, the scars tell the story of a life lived amid the pain and suffering of a world crying out for redemption. One of the people in the New York Times article said the scars on the resurrected body of Christ allows us to make meaning out of the losses of our lives, to make meaning out of our lives. And I think this is especially true, especially important for victims of trauma and violence. We can never erase the scars of what happened to us, but the more we are able to integrate them into our lives by telling the story, the more we're able to find healing and really become a healing presence for others. Peace comes through the wounds on the resurrected body of Christ. When Jesus shows his scars to his disciples, he's not only saying to them, see, it's really me. He's also reminding them that he was a victim of torture. He was a victim of torture who triumphed over the evil that was done to him. And that's what set us on the path to a new creation. True peace can only come through the scars on the resurrected body of Christ. As we heard last Sunday, when Jesus first appears to his disciples huddled in fear in that upper room, Thomas is absent. I was born and raised here in Missouri, which calls itself the Show Me State. And many of you have often heard me say that Thomas is the patron saint of Missouri, that he won't believe until you show me. A week later, Jesus appears to his disciples again. Once again, remember, the door is locked. Even though the disciples have experienced the resurrected Lord the week before, they're still huddled in fear. It wasn't an instant effect for them. And this time, Thomas is with them. And now Jesus is asking Thomas to be accountable. He invites him to touch his wounds and to believe. I believe Thomas often gets a bad rap, I think, because he doubted the resurrection. And many people mistake that doubt is the opposite of faith. But as Father Tom, the spiritual advisor for Annie Lamott, told her, the opposite of faith is not doubt, it's certainty. Certainty is missing the point entirely. Faith includes noticing the mess, the emptiness, the discomfort, and let it be until the light returns. That's what Thomas reflects for us, an adult kind of faith that includes a large measure of doubt. Violence has scarred so many people in our world today. And with so much violence, the question is, where do we look for hope? Where do we see hope? I find hope in that image of Jesus appearing to his disciples in that upper room and breathing on them and saying, peace be with you. He shows them how forgiveness and peace comes through the wound, comes through that breathing, that new breath, that breath of a risen but scarred Lord. For me, the wounds in the resurrected body of Christ have always been the access point, the entry point into the life of God. The resurrection doesn't erase the wounds, it doesn't erase the scars of our past, but rather incorporates them, allowing us to move to become a new creation. As Andy Crouch in that article in the New York Times is quoted, if a scar is a healed wound, perhaps our scars, which are often the source of our shame and regret, are really the true clues we have into the full form of our resurrection bodies. The echoes of an old story come to mind that I've used often, but God is not going to go looking for our degrees or diplomas or how many books we wrote or how much money we made in this world. God is going to ask us one thing: where are your scars? And if we say we have no scars, God is going to say, was there no one or nothing worth fighting for? Not fighting with weapons of mass destruction, but fighting out of a sense of love that each and every person is worth fighting for. God thought we were worth fighting for. Jesus thought we were worth fighting for and dying for. As we gather around the tables of Eucharist, as we gather around those tables with our families, as we seek to move through this time of terrible violence in our country, may we inhale deeply that spirit, that breath of God. Allow that breath to renew us and resurrect us to be a people wounded and scarred, but still believing in the presence and possibility of Christ's peace. Peace be with you and your family. Take good care as we continue to meet in prayer.